Hello, everybody. What's up? I'm here to talk to you on Percona Live about a trend in open source that I am really troubled by. It's a trend of kind of calling things open source that aren't. And so it's this bait and switch attitude. And I feel that right now we're in a very dangerous place for open source, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. I've talked to other folks about this over the last few months, and there's a lot of concern across the industry about this trend. But first, before I get into this, let me start with an introduction. My name is Matt Yonkovit, and I am the head of open source strategy. This is me, or the FOSS here at Percona, for short. You can find me on Twitter, LinkedIn, everywhere that social media is. But you can also take a look at our podcast, which is the Hoss Talks FOSS. Excuse me. Now, we've got over 20 episodes already, specifically talking about open source and the direction of things, new products, new features, things like that. If you are interested in that, feel free to check us out on your favorite podcast app or on YouTube. We are there. So let me start with a little bit about myself. Now, many of you out there are probably in the same boat that I am, and you grew up on Saturday morning cartoons of some kind or some form. And, I was, a child in the 80s, and, Transformers, G.I. Joe, these were staples of, Saturday morning cartoonage. And I love Transformers. In fact, that was one of my favorite shows. You'd have to get up really early. For whatever reason, the local television station decided that they should put Transformers on at like 6:30 in the morning. And so I would have to get up on Saturday morning at like 6 to make sure I could watch it. And unfortunately, I'd have to watch the end of a child show called Romper Room, where that came on first, just to watch Transformers. But love the Transformers. It was something that was near and dear to my heart. So, the enterprising folks over at Hasbro made a full line of Transformers. And, of course, that's what you ask for Christmas, right? So who doesn't want to, get toys and, of the things that they love the most? And so I remember fondly, picking out the toys that I wanted. I wanted the Optimus Prime, or I wanted the, the Soundstream, or I wanted the, Megatron. And so it was, you pick those out. And so, Christmas morning, you're like, woo, so excited. You run downstairs and you see the presents, and, you start opening them up. And unfortunately, your parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles don't know the difference between Transformers and Gobots. Now, I don't know how many of you have followed, Saturday morning cartoons, or, the difference between Gobots and Transformers, but there is quite a difference. From a Gobot perspective, their arms don't move very well. They're just kind of like this, and they don't transform very well. So, honestly speaking, they're the shittier version, right? Like, so it's the toy that you're kind of like, oh, yeah. If I squint hard enough, I could kind of think that it was a Transformer, and I could kind of play with it in the same way, but I really wanted the Transformer. Okay? This is not unusual, though, right? There's a lot of times when, you get something that is really good, and then someone knocks it off, and, fools people into thinking it's the original, or it's the same thing. And, you see this especially with success, right? And so, who doesn't love the movie Star Wars? Actually, there are a few people, but we won't talk about them. Success breeds imitators. So just like Transformers, you are often going to have, different people who are going to look at that success and say, I want a piece of that. And so they'll just make movies or TV shows or whatever that are very similar in nature, to try and capture people in that market who are very excited and use those products or like that franchise. You could see that today with the comic book movies, right? So it started with, a very few amount of, movies, and then like a couple, additional, franchises came on, and now all of a sudden my Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and everything else is loaded with comic book movies from obscure comic book series that you've never heard of, or that maybe were popular only amongst a small crowd, which is cool in some ways, but it's also interesting when you get a lot of crappy ones too. So it's like Star Wars, it had a huge following and a lot of success. It had imitators as well. In fact, one of the most famous imitations is what is affectionately referred to as Turkish Star Wars. And Turkish Star Wars is a knockoff that in Turkey they decided to make basically what is kind of a Star Wars-esque movie. Now, what sets this apart is they actually took footage from Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, all kinds of other, movies and spliced them in. So it's kind of a disjointed mess, but it is so epically bad. Everyone knows that it's not the same thing, but it like transcends, horribleness into like an awesome thing. So, it's fun in a different way. But here's the thing. A lot of people will see this and they'll not mistake this for the original Star Wars. So in the Star Wars universe, it's funny because sometimes their own worst enemy is themselves. Because, they did the original Star Wars on a lower budget. They didn't have much, faith that it would actually turn out into something. And then, over time, they start to evolve it. And, you start to improve things, make them better. And in the case of Star Wars, you introduce characters like the beloved Jar Jar Binks. I say that sarcastically. But you continue to try and like push the envelope, do more things, see what we can do to capture more. And you get a little bit more cocky, right? Let's be honest. We're going to go out there and do that. So you can go too far. And, so not only are you seeing imitators, but a lot of times companies themselves can evolve in ways that are unrecognizable to what they originally were. And part of this is because, as Steven Spielberg once said, everybody loves a winner, but nobody loves a winner, right? And what that means is, while people love winners, they all really secretly want to beat them, and they want, they're always trying to say like, oh, the Star Wars guys did a great job, but we're going to do better, right? And so they're always looking for ways that they think that they could do it better. And you look at the history of companies, and you see this as well. So way back in the day, and this is always famous, and the Microsoft folks always cringe when I bring this up, but, Steve Ballmer hated open source. Hated it, right? It's a cancer. It's, awful. You can't have Linux. It's a horrible thing. And so, as Linux grew in popularity and open source grew in popularity, Microsoft continued to up the rhetoric and try and, convince people it was the wrong thing to do. But now look at it, right? So open source is a winner. And of course, Microsoft loves the winner. So Microsoft is totally embracing open source and everything around the open source side. So not only did they hate it originally, and, now they're kind of joining the bandwagon, joining the party. And, you wonder what Steve would say. Would he say, oops, my bad? Is he rolling over in his grave? Who knows? But it is something that, is mindful. But all of those things continue to happen, and they're happening in open source. And that brings us to this very dangerous time in the open source space, right? It is a dangerous time for all of us, and I want to talk to you a little bit about what I see and why I'm concerned about this. So before I get into that, I'm going to put half of you to sleep for 15 minutes. Okay? So if you want to, you're watching YouTube, go. If you don't want to understand, the different ways open source businesses make money, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. But it is really important, if you don't understand how open source companies are built and how they make money, to understand that kind of basic philosophy before we get into some of the discussions on what's happening. All right? Great. So, the first question I have for those who are still watching and haven't fast forwarded is when you think of a company, you're going to start an open source project. You're a maintainer, you're a creator. What is your goal? What do you define success as? Okay, and this is probably one of the most critical questions that you can answer from an open source project perspective. And this will dictate what your future looks like quite a bit, right? Because a lot of community people start off as a very community approach, and they have a very focused goal that doesn't necessarily match what investors' goals are. And so when you ask yourself, why did you get involved in open source? Was it because you wanted to create a company, become rich, be supportive? Did you believe in it? Did you love it? Did you want to contribute? Did you see a problem that you just had to solve, right? Different people get involved for different reasons, and those reasons dictate how the companies evolve and form, okay? And a lot of people do get into open source because it is a business and they want to make money off of it. But a profitable open source business is hard, right? It's really, really hard. I'm telling you. You can have companies that make a lot of money. Doesn't necessarily mean they're profitable. Now, when we look at how difficult it is, let's consider a few facts. Okay, so we surveyed over 700 people this past year, and then the year before over 800, and we were looking at trends, right? But there's some interesting things. 2/3 of companies that use open source software are not willing to pay for it, right? So think about like you've created a company, and you've got 1 million users. 666,000 are predisposed to never pay you. So your market is this big, and now it got cut into 1/3. Okay? And 1/3 that do pay, right, are paying only because of insurance. And so that means that, it's we want to pay just in case something happens. So the other 2/3 need to see some value, and if the value isn't there, they're going to be out. So you can see like your market shrinking as you go, okay? And you've got to understand that open source is a very passionate area, and when you look at the different ways that you can make money, and we'll talk about that in a second. You have things like, support contracts or service contracts, and service contracts have a retention rate that's lower because typically they're focused on when a problem happens. So that's a very difficult business to maintain a consistent, retention rate and revenue stream. And, not only that, when you do focus on the software, and if you try to go open core, there's always the risk that someone forks or takes something and open sources it for free and replicates those features you're trying to make money off of, right? So you've got a lot of competition that you wouldn't normally have, because basically what you're doing is you're giving away that open source to anyone who wants to use it, and then companies can take it and they can make those enterprise features they need themselves if they want to. It's a heavy investment. A lot of them don't. Some of them do, right? And of course, in the database space especially, databases are uncool, right? So a lot of things that are kind of working against these models. And what you have to understand is when money starts to get involved in any business or any project, they're looking for the things that are going to generate the most stickiness. Currently, the big model that we have, you might hear it referred to as a freemium model. You might hear it referred to as the land and expand model. There's all kinds of different terms in the industry for this model. You start small and the company grows. So you start with, the beachhead, if you will, is you land on the beach and you get, 1 or 2 people at a company to use your software, and then you get them to be fervent users and then grow that footprint over time. But these models typically only work if you have retention. And so I can guarantee you that if you work at an open source company or involved in an open source company The executive teams at those companies have had many a conversation about how do we make things stickier. Okay, that's a term that is often used in the industry to talk about retention rates. How do we keep people here? Now, there is a fine line between lock-in and stickiness. Okay, and so I want to make that clear because we tend to throw out the term lock-in as a bad term because locking someone in prevents them from moving somewhere else. However, when we talk about stickiness, okay, you can get stickiness from multiple things, right? So stickiness isn't necessarily bad. If you're treating the customers right and the customers see value, then they're going to be sticky. They're going to want to work with you, right? You don't have to go to your favorite restaurant. Nothing locks you into going to your favorite restaurant. Why do you go to your favorite restaurant week after week or month after month? Because you like it. Because you prefer it. It's the same thing with watching a television show or playing a video game. You're not locked in. There's nothing preventing you from leaving. You are finding that the experience is really worthwhile. And when you talk about lock-in is more about the experience doesn't matter, you're stuck. Good example of this is, you start relying on a feature that is only available in a paid-for version of software. How difficult is it for you to pull that software out and rewrite your application to not use that feature? The harder it is, the more locked in you are. Whereas from a sticky perspective, if you provide someone with value and they can, that they're there because they want to be there, you have a happier customer. But it's also a little bit more dangerous because you always have to one-up yourself and make sure that customers are the center of your business. So it is definitely a different model, and it is a challenging model for sure. Good example I'd like to, I'll point out is MySQL and the MySQL Enterprise Monitor. The MySQL Enterprise Monitor provided an immense amount of value to a lot of customers. In fact, I remember when I worked at MySQL, released this software. There were a lot of people who were willing to pay just for the MySQL Enterprise Monitor. Can you not monitor databases on your own? No, you can. It just makes it easier. And so that provides people with the ability, we're going to start building, stuff on this tool. Certainly, if you start relying on it too much, then you can quote unquote get locked in a little bit. But you're providing value, and the application itself isn't necessarily locked in, to that particular version. So let's talk about the different models that are out there. Okay, and so there are quite a few different models. There's some that I probably won't touch on that are a little bit more obscure, but I'm just going to go through the bigger ones. And so, probably one of the most well-known models is the services-only model, right? This is where an open source company or project basically says, okay, you guys can use the software for free, but if you need help, you can come to us. And you can have that through, a support contract or managed service contract or consulting contract. These typically are fairly low margin businesses because it is predicated on helping people when they need it. It's very people focused. It's not necessarily software focused. But this is where customers continually have to find the value in your software, in your project, in your services. Okay? And, this is where you're kind of beholden to a lot of external factors, right? So you can have a really, really good relationship with the VP of a company because you've helped them through numerous times. That VP leaves, someone else new comes in, they might not value that, and so that relationship needs to be built from the ground up again. So it has a lower stickiness factor because you have to continually prove your value. So a lot of investors look at a services-only model and they're like, not really all that exciting. Now, open core has been one of the most popular of the open source business models out there. It's kind of got a medium value. It's got a decent amount of stickiness. Not great. It does provide some inflection points where there can be some migration points and some things. But you do risk getting disrupted by free. But this has been probably the predominant model over the last 10 years for open source companies to follow. You have an open, version that is open source version that's completely free, and then you provide some value, whether it's encryption features or security features or scale features. A lot of people have looked at, if you want to run a cluster, then you have to, run the enterprise version or something like that. But because it is open source, you can be disrupted. People can develop alternative, software and methodologies to get around that. Because remember, the majority of people don't want to pay you. So the majority of people are still going to be in that free space. So it really kind of pushes off, some of the stickiness issues with services, provides you with some stickiness in a smaller group of people, but then allows you to retain a bit more control. But now, where we're moving, what will be the predominant model of the next 10 years is the as a service. Okay, and this is where vendors have realized that if they install, manage, and own the infrastructure, that has an insanely high value and an insanely high stickiness. Because the value for a lot of companies is it's super easy. You get these seamless upgrades. You don't have to, quote unquote, pay for experts, but you're giving up control. And with that control, that's where, the lock-in kind of occurs. And so you get a bit more of this really high stickiness factor from an as a service, because if you are all in on using, your favorite cloud provider's database as a service, or you build your applications using their, infrastructure as a service components, to rip those out are nearly impossible without rewriting the entire application, right? So high stickiness. So this is where investors right now are really all in on this. And of course, there is this mix, and you can mix any of those three together, and people do, right? Where you're trying to bring in that services aspect, provide the high value, focus on the software tooling as opposed to the, databases themselves. So value added, kind of do it yourself type stuff. So all kinds of different models there, but those are the predominant ones. So when we start to look at commercial open source software, or COSS, as some people have referred to it as, there is a pretty big risk out there. So I remember I asked you, why did you get involved? Who did you build this software for? Okay. And so when you look at that question, there are some logical, choices. I could give you probably A, B, C, D. Who are you building it for? And, you can ask, is it for the people who are just the general world at large? You're trying to make the world a better place? Maybe you're trying to make the community, your local community, or the community of database users, or the community of Linux users, a better place. Or maybe, you just want to take your software and find a user space that it's like, you're just going to do it for the users, those who love the product or the software that you do. But most of the time, commercial open source software is built for shareholders, right? Look at the original OG of the open source exit, which is MySQL, right? One of the largest, most successful exits early on in the days of open source. What you have is a company that figured out how to take that free and make it something that investors wanted to pay for, a big company wanted to pay for. And remember how I said that success breeds imitators, right? So this spawned an entire generation of database products, database companies, open source products, open source companies that were all focused on how to do that. Because when you have investors, what investors see is, oh my God, look at open source software, the adoption is massive. Look at how many downloads they have. Ooh, millions of downloads. I've had conversations with people over the years who have like focused on like, well, how many downloads? And then they'll do a calculation in the back of the napkin. Well, if we can get, X amount of them to buy this, da 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 da. Oh yeah, your company's worth, X million dollars. Because they get excited when they see, a mass movement of adoption. It really does excite them. And the thing that they think about isn't necessarily that, look at all the users we're helping. They think, how can I monetize that? What can I do to turn that into a really profitable business model? Right? That's where people are thinking is they're like, oh, I've got money. I want to invest. How do I turn this into this super profitable model? And, we're now in this space where open source is the rule for a lot of investment companies and a lot of companies looking to build new software. It's the cool fad. It's where you want to start because guess what? We can drive that adoption. We can drive that freemium model. And that's where the mentality is right now. Okay? You can see here, this is from the Linux Foundation. They wrote an article, where we are now, open source is kind of the rule as opposed to the exception to the rule. And we saw that with Microsoft. And, investment firms look at this and they understand this, right? Open source works for adoption purposes, but is poor for monetization. Unless you're monetizing at different levels. Or the beauty of open source from an investor perspective is disruption, not innovation. I don't care about innovation. I don't care about new stuff. We're going to disrupt the market. But when you are the market, when you are the establishment, who disrupts you? And we're in this weird space now where open source is the standard. It is, the 800-pound, gorilla in the room. And because people are looking to push that monetization, a lot of investors come in. And what they'll do is they'll, say like, okay, we've got millions of users. You project owners, you people who, got the millions of people to adopt the software, you don't necessarily know how to monetize this. We do. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in our own management team. And so if you look at, most of the open source companies that are out there who are in the commercial space, this is, I went through and, took, 5 companies that are in the open source space that had changed licenses recently, right? And I looked at their management teams, and I went onto LinkedIn, and I saw what companies they worked for, right? So it happens in every company. You get new investors, you get bought by someone. The original executive team sticks around for a year. Typically, they're contractually obligated for that. But then the investors bring in an entire team to monetize it and bring you to the next level. Look at the companies that are on this list. This is not a heavy open source pedigree list. In fact, you can make the argument Google, they're not really an open source company, but they do a lot of open source. But, Oracle, VMware, LinkedIn, BMC, Informatica, Symantec, New Relic, IBM, Sun, Cisco, Conga, Bond, Citrix. I mean, you look at these companies, these people are not necessarily coming from a background of this is how open source works. They're coming from a background of this is how business works. This is how we optimize revenue streams. And it's a very different model when you think about it, right? It's a very different model. And in fact, some companies are very open about they don't really care about innovation. They don't really care about the open source community in general. They view this as purely a business model, right? MongoDB, CEO. We didn't open source this product to get help from the community or to make the product better. We open sourced as a freemium strategy to drive adoption. So this is the first taste is free. Once we get our drugs into your system, then you're stuck with us, and it's going to be really hard to get you out. It's interesting because when you talk about companies that know how to monetize, they're first and foremost looking at how do we bring stickiness, how do we lock in. And if you don't believe me, look at investors, because investors love this strategy. They'll invest more money because of it. There's this article that came out about a year ago, a little over a year ago now. If I had invested $1,000 in Mongo's IPO, how much would it be today? And the analyst is like, oh my God, database lock-in is so awesome. This is how Oracle was built in the 90s. This makes it a great investment, right? Because people will never move off because data is so hard to move and it's so big and all this other stuff. So investors view this strategy as a strategy to lock companies in, prevent them from moving, and then you can raise rates, you can do all kinds of stuff, and we can be the next Oracle. The whole reason open source databases became so popular was because Oracle was such a bad player in the space back in the day. They've gotten better, right? But there was a lot of hatred towards Oracle's business practices. Now we're building open source companies that want to be the next Oracle. And they want to follow those same business practices. It seems like a really bad thing, right? That's really bad. We need to avoid that. But when you look at these companies that are in this space, right, open source companies aren't profitable right now. They're making lots of revenue, okay, and but they're spending more than they make. Look at Mongo. The revenue for 2020 was $422 million. That's up from $267 million. But look at the negatives, the losses. They had to spend almost $200 million more than they made in order to get that, which then made their value increase. Because they're following what is referred to as the eventual profitability model. It's like the eventual consistency model, only a little different, right? They're predicated, most of these companies' models are predicated on every user we get is a potential expansion opportunity. Every user we get will lock in, and then we don't have to worry about them anymore. We just got to go get more users. And eventually, we'll have a deluge of users who are stuck on our systems and, have to continue to pay us, and will start to buy more stuff from us. That's a really good model for investors. It's a bad model for users. And this is why you're starting to see the licensing whack-a-mole happen, right? These companies aren't profitable. These companies need ways to, increase their revenue, decrease their losses, and hold on to whatever footholds, whatever people they have already got. They don't want them to go elsewhere. And so, you start with the GPL, and hey, if you distribute it, you have to use it, or you have to share your code. So that way no one can create an enterprise version of, your open source software and sell it without distributing it. That way one company can control the IP and they can sell you the enterprise version. Well, Cloud disrupted that, because guess what? Cloud is not distributing. You're just using an enhanced version of MySQL or an enhanced version of Postgres or an enhanced version of Mongo. So, we need to change that. AGPL, we'll throw in the network clause to try and deal with that. Not really helping. Database as a service, SaaS companies continue to grow. They are a existential threat to the classic cost model, because they can basically sell you stuff that is just as good, and people aren't, going to pay anyways. So they'll pay for hosting. So let's do our own database as a service and create the SSPL, which is really an anti-cloud license. So you see this kind of, escalation, if you will. Don't believe me about the Lockin stuff. There's a really, really good example of this. Okay, that just came out. I don't know if anybody saw this Wired article. I read it and I thought, wow, this is just what's happening in the software space, only at McDonald's. So let me tell you the story. So I don't know how many people here have ever gotten a McDonald's ice cream cone, right? They have this machine that you see here, and they'll walk up to it, they'll pull the handle, and then the ice cream will come out soft serve into the cone, and they'll sell you the 99-cent cone. Now, McDonald's has a company that manufactures this for them. All franchises are required to use the McDonald's authorized ice cream machine and the McDonald's authorized supplier and service provider for this. And these things notoriously are bad. This and the shake machine are notoriously bad devices that require a ton of maintenance. I can tell you that in the past, there's probably been 3 or 4 times I used to work at McDonald's way back when I was in high school, that these machines would break down, 2-3 times a week. And so, you ever go to the drive-thru or go to McDonald's and, like a shake or an ice cream cone, sorry, the machine's down. Well, McDonald's franchises, which are not owned by corporate McDonald's, they're owned by an individual person who then buys the franchise rights and then has to buy the equipment from the company and set it up in the manner and follow the rules that the company sets, gets these machines from them. And every time they break, they have to call this one company to fix it. If the machine is too runny, if the machine isn't cold enough, if the machine, is spitting at the wrong consistency, anything that has to happen, they have to call this company. Well, these people found that there's basically a Konami code on this device that allows you to get to the menu and set, things like, oh, I need to lower the temperature a little bit because the machine's too hot, or the consistency's wrong, so let me go ahead and increase the creaminess, or whatever. Okay, and so they built a small device that enables you to access that device without entering the Konami code. And I mean, it was probably like pull, handle, left, right, A, B, 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 start, it was something like that. But they built this device that just allows people who have already bought, these are not leasing this, they bought this machine to fix it. And now McDonald's is threatening lawsuits. They're sending letters to franchises that say your franchise is forfeit if you fix these machines on your own. So this is a case of lock-in that exists outside of the software space, but they completely control that market for soft serve ice cream, and any threat to that, they're looking to squash. And this is the same thing with when you look at SSPL, or you look at different licensing schemes or things like that. Basically what you're doing is you're saying, I see a threat to my business and I want the adoption and the name that comes with open source. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to be called an open source company, but I'm going to prevent certain people from ever using or selling things based on my stuff. It's a weird mix. Either you're locked in or you're not. Now, let's look at some different open source companies, and let's dig into the interesting case. So there's always been this divide between open and not open companies, right? Some companies are very focused on hey, we're going to keep things open and we're going to do things the right way. In fact, Elastic made this commitment when they changed AGPL a few years ago that their AGPL changes will be the only changes they make. Everything else will stay Apache 2 forever, and they will never change it. Wait a minute. They did change it, didn't they? Okay. Sorry. Just had a glitch there. So not so fast, right? Elastic did change its licensing. Okay. It changed its licensing to be more restrictive because they were worried about the cloud. Now, keep in mind, their revenue doubled between 2019 and 2020. $400+ million. So it's not that they're not making money, they're not profitable. But there's a market that is out there that they can't tackle because it's being sucked up by Amazon or other cloud providers. And so they're going to focus on, monetizing the cloud any way that they can, and that means that they're going to change their licenses. And this is purely a monetary play, right? It really is. Now, when you look at, the reasons why, they gave some fairly, serious accusations, right? Trademark violations, third-party code contributions that were copied from closed source software, okay? IP theft, misleading customers. They don't give anything to us. They're not good community players, right? So all of these things are reasons why Elastic said they had to make the change that they did. And to give you a little bit of a timeline, pre-2018, Elastic was fully open, do whatever you want, Apache 2 license. Okay? In 2018, they doubled down on open. That's their blog title, by releasing all of their tooling as open core under an AGPL license. Okay, so again, hey, you can take the open source software, do what you want with the server side, but the tooling, if you want tooling, you're going to have to then do open core. Because of that change, Amazon, other people use a lot of the tooling. So AWS announces they're going to do the open distro, which is going to take the pieces that were Apache 2 before they changed to AGPL and continue them as Apache 2. Well, then we get a lawsuit, right? So lawsuits against both AWS and a company called SearchGuard, who were also doing some things with the tooling space. And then, of course, this year, Elastic goes SSPL. And I will give Elastic credit for calling this out, that they are no longer open source. Okay. Now, that being said, they're saying they're open. So they're trying to, play with words, do some marketing here that, we're open, but we're not open source. But it's just as good. It's like Gobots and Transformers, right? It's just as good. It's not really. So, the article that announced the SSPL was doubling down on Open 2, or Open again or something like that. So it's a weird thing that, you want to be associated with open source. You want to be associated with open because you want that quote unquote freemium model, but you don't want to pay the toll of being actually open. That's wrong. Now, it's that back and forth that drives people batty, right? There were I've heard a number anywhere from 2,400 to 3,600 contributors to Elastic that contributed code. And they believed Elastic when they said they will never change the license. So how can you trust companies out there that they're not going to change the license? As soon as an investor changes, as soon as money comes in, as soon as new management comes in, they're not looking at open source the same way as a lot of original investors are. Now, I don't think this is purely about cloud disruption. And certainly, Elastic isn't the only company to do this. Now, it is interesting to note that a lot of these companies share the same investors. Because It is a monetary scheme. They need more market share to reach profitability. It's a scheme that you have companies that are basically borrowing money to get more customers to eventually break even. And they're willing to burn the community in order to chase the additional dollars. Right? I think this is all about control money and exit plans. Now, when we look at specific, concerns that were brought up, okay, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not going to get into the legal arguments about this. But you can look at the court filing. I have the link here in this presentation. But, they say that there was code ripped and moved, okay, from a enterprise repository to an open source repository, which is wrong. I am not going to get into the legal of that. Amazon says they do their due diligence. They completely think this is okay. It's complicated with open source software because it was open, then it wasn't open, and then it moved. And there's this fine line between infringing and inspired by. And that's where I think that a lot of people, especially investors who come from the proprietary space, they're used to patents. They're used to patenting ideas. They're used to taking, things and taking concepts and, holding on to them, right? So, if you want to, open your car door this way, then you have to have, be mindful of the patent because I patented the way to open my car door. There was a famous case where some girl patented a way to swing on a swing set, right? I own that. So now if you ever advertise that or do anything with it, then it's mine. Part of the open source philosophy and the open source movement has always been looking at what's out there and copying. Now, I'm not saying a one-for-one copy of code, but what I'm saying is inspired by alternatives. Man, I really don't like how this backup works. I'm going to build my own. Well, how do they do backups? They do hot backups. They use this API. I think I'll use the API too. Let me build a new one. Now, of course, again, I'm not a lawyer. I haven't looked code by code, line by line, but there is a fine line here. And in fact, a lot of vendors know that there's a fine line here and will rewrite, open source contributions. We've provided patches to many upstream projects and many upstream companies over the years. And a lot of them will be like, oh, wow, that's great. But I'm going to take that patch and rewrite it. So there is no IP infringement or there's no question of legality. Because there are really fine lines here. So don't know the specifics there, but it's something important. Now, trademarks are often something that is used in the open source space as a way or an asset within a company as a way to kind of differentiate, right? So, there can only be one MongoDB. There can only be one MySQL. And so there is an intrinsic value in having that name because when you go for help, for MongoDB, the first place you're going to do is mongodb.com or mysql.com for MySQL. You go to those locations. But there are things you can do with trademarks that are legally allowed and that companies clearly call out. For instance, and it's very gray area. Okay. You can't call something, Joe Schmo MySQL, but you could call it Joe Schmo for MySQL, right? You can also use terms like, descriptive terms like MySQL consulting or MySQL managed service or MySQL services, because those are, you're offering that service for that product. So there's nuance here, but a lot of times trademarks are really selectively enforced until there's an issue, which also causes problems. Now, of course, as these shenanigans happen, the open source community can always respond with forks. And, Amazon announced that they were doing, the open distro before. Now they have completely forked everything and have called it OpenSearch, which there is an entire track here at Percona Live on if you're interested in that. So part of the power of the open source community is keeping vendors honest and holding them accountable, right? And the ability to say, if you are not a good steward of this, then you have placed your open source code into the public domain. Someone else can take it and make sure that the community lives on. But as we start to restrict these licenses, that becomes less and less of an option in many cases. You can always go back to the last open source version and then fork it, which is what Amazon effectively did. But this is a massive challenge and concern because it changes how open source evolves and how it has grown. So there are upsides and downsides to everything. Now, when we talk about the SSPL, it is designed to limit and restrict usage in a database as a service environment. SSPL is, designed as the source is available, but you can only use the software in certain connotations and basically not in a direct competition with us. But then there's all this gray area. It basically says that you can't offer a service on top of this. But then people started to complain, well, we do consulting services. Well, so then there's some carve-outs and so there's some weird things. But it basically locks in all of the competition to filter through one company. To get around that, anything that you use that is SSPL related has to be released under the SSPL. It's a poison pill clause. In fact, AGPL was a poison pill clause. There are many companies that do not allow AGPL software on their premises, which enables AGPL companies to sell commercial versions and dual license. So it is something that for companies, sometimes it's a no-go. And when we look at why this hurts, when you look at open source, what makes it so special, in my opinion, and, for investors it's going to be because of the adoption, but from a community perspective, it's the community, the collaboration, the freedom, the innovation, the equality, right? I could take it, run it, do whatever I want with it, build all kinds of cool things, enhance it, and I can do it all for free. And the issue that I see with the SSPL is you're putting limitations on innovation and community, right? A lot of software innovation comes from companies that are pushing the envelope, that are providing services or providing tooling or other things around those ecosystems. MySQL has famously been made better by the competition. Keep in mind that MySQL itself didn't own InnoDB. InnoDB was a third-party product owned by Oracle. So innovation is often bred by competition. It's often bred by having the ability to, hack, to play, to start your own company, to try things. MySQL had so much competition back in the day from so many different vendors, it was crazy. But most of them failed. But a lot of the stuff they worked on still lives today. I mean, I can tell you there were numerous appliances, numerous technology spaces that just didn't take off. But a lot of those ideas still exist. And we've put a limiter on those ideas with some of the new licensing and some of the new focus. And this is where the danger really exists, right? open source is really being hijacked and turned into a freemium business model that has nothing to do with having the open source philosophy or the open source, core. Contributors are being treated as second-class citizens. So how long are they going to continue to contribute and innovate? Are we going to enter a dark age of innovation when it comes to open source? The other issue that you run into is this next generation of people coming out of college, coming into the open source space. They're seeing these schemes, and they're looking at them as the normal. This is the model that if I want to start an open source company, I should follow. And that's just wrong. And the companies that are making these tweaks, I'm going to be honest, SSPL isn't going to make these companies profitable. It's not. So they're going to tweak more. The next thing that comes out, they're going to put more restrictions on. The next management change at these companies, they're going to try something a little different. And when they find out that, maybe open source can't make money, they're not going to take open source seriously anymore. So this is going to drive changes in the industry in the long term. Isn't it ironic that some of the open source software that exists today is built upon other open source software? And if the restrictions that exist today were still, in place back then, these companies wouldn't even exist, right? If you talk about libraries that Mongo uses, or Lucene, which Elastic, used, all of these different things, they drove innovation, and these companies built upon them. And now we're trying to restrict the next generation from doing the same thing that they did to become successful. And I'm going to leave you with this, right? There's an old Cherokee proverb. Which wolf will we feed? There's a battle of two wolves inside us. One is the joy, peace, love, hope, and the other one is the jealousy, greed, resentment, lies, inferiority, ego. And they're battling. And the Cherokee proverb is, asks which one will win, and it's whichever one you feed. And the more we feed into the paranoia that we need to lock down our open source software, we need to prevent others from potentially having, business models that benefit from it, the more we're going to feed the wrong wolf.